I've got good news and bad news. There's no bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah this week. That's the bad news, because that means that I have to write 2 sermons for this weekend. Because normally at least one of the kids can help me out on that. The good news is that this Parashat Mishpatim, contains my single favorite verse in the whole Torah. And I'll thank you not to tell the other verses of the Torah. They might get embarrassed. But the other good thing about this is that because I have 2 different services to give sermons in, I can serialize it. Right, we've been watching some of the old serials at home, like Commando Cody and those things that would come in before movies, and they'd leave you with a cliffhanger ending. So I may leave you with a cliffhanger ending tonight. No promises, but we'll see how it goes. So in order to build up to that single favorite verse of the Torah, I'm going to start a bit of a countdown. We're going to start with my 3rd favorite verse of the Torah, and that happens to be in this week's Parsha. It is Exodus. This is the greatest hits this week, so I'm glad you're here. It happens to be Exodus, or Shmot, chapter 23, verse 19. Remember that now. It's 23:19, and part of that verse says, "You shall not seethe a kid in its mother's milk." And you may be wondering, why is that even in the top 20? I mean, this rabbi must be crazy about kasher. Can't wait to go to his house. But it has a special association for me. I have children of various ages, which means I've watched various eras of animated movies to death. And there's one particular movie that was popular when my second oldest was young, called Monsters, Inc. And this was a sort of a fantasy world entirely populated by monsters, and they generated their energy by collecting. They would scare children at night. That was their monsters. That was their job. And then they would the sound from the screaming would create energy, and then they would power their entire civilization on the screams of children. And so it's a lot cuter than it sounds. If you haven't seen this movie, it's really adorable. And I knew when I saw this movie, there are Jews who work at Pixar. And not just any Jews. There are learned scholars of Torah who work at Pixar. And not just learned scholars of Torah, but good kids who listened to their Yiddish mamas. Right? Good kids with good neshamas who listened to their Jewish mothers and knew Torah very well. Because there's this one scene where they're in this liminal space between the monster world and the child world. And as you can imagine, it's a little bit like radioactivity. Like if you get too close to your source of energy, it can be dangerous. It could be toxic for you. And so when there was this sort of breach, this containment breach between the monster world and the child world, this alarm goes off. And the windows shudder, and these special forces looking monsters repelled from the ceiling, and they threw this monster into containment, and they washed all his fur and just make sure everything was okay. And they knew that it was time to do this because somebody shouted out, "Guys, we have a 2319. It's a condition 2319." And they said, oh, 2319. Everybody knew what that meant. And that meant that everybody just stopped what they were doing to make sure you separated everything that needed to be separated. And so I just internalized this, and I didn't think much about it until I'm in rabbinical school and I'm having to study all the laws of kashrut. And I see one of the 3 places in the Torah, it says this: "You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk." Exodus 23:19. So I knew that whoever was writing this movie had one of those parents, we'll say, it's not just mamas, but they've perfected it. One of these parents who just panic when there's some sort of breach of kashrut in the house. It made me think of that scene from another movie, A Stranger Among Us, which is sort of the Hasidic witness, if you will, where this one detective who's not in the kashrut world tries to put away a bottle of milk in the meat fridge, and the person in the kitchen does like a Secret Service jump in front of the milk to make sure it doesn't happen. And so maybe not so much because of my love, they get along with kashrut, but because of this association with my children's childhood, this little kernel of Yiddishkeit that's in the popular culture. And like I said, it's not just mentioned once in the Torah. There's actually 3 times in the Torah it says, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. But this is my favorite for that reason. But also in this parsha is my second favorite passage of the Torah. It's not just one verse. It's actually a few verses together that I want to share with you. And I'm going to use Nechama Leibovitz's translation because it's particularly wrathful. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger, nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If you do, if thou afflict them in any wise, and they cry at all unto me, I shall surely hear their cry. My anger shall burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. And you may be thinking, wow, I thought he was a creep for loving kashrut so much. We're talking about widows and orphans and slayings with swords and things like this. Why is this so important? Because this is the cornerstone of the job of the Jew in the world, in my humble opinion. We have continuously survived as a people in some form or another, but continuously for thousands of years. That has made us witnesses in continuous observation of the world in all of its glory, in all of its goodness, and all of its atrocity. We carry that memory within us. Within us, yes, you were strangers in Egypt. That's why you don't oppress. Because you are you say every year on Passover, we get to celebrate Passover because God heard our cry. God remembered God's covenant with our foremothers and forefathers. And this is to remind us that the God who hears our cry is not just listening to us. And all we have to do to act right in the world is to remember our experience, to remember where we come from, because we already know what it's like to be a stranger. And not just strangers. We'll come back to strangers in a second, but the reason I put these verses together, the reason the Torah puts these verses together, is they're like, I'm not just talking about people who don't look like you or sound like you or cook like you. Lest you think that, let's talk about the people among you who are your people and weak. See, the Torah puts into the same category the stranger, the widow, and the orphan to teach us that anybody who fits this paradigm of not having the same support structure, not having the same privilege that you do, is your responsibility. And it doesn't just say this once. There are some very popular things in Judaism that we derive from scant proof text. I hate saying scant about the text that I love, but If you want to know where the mitzvah of lighting Shabbos candles comes from, it's buried someplace in Isaiah, actually. Oneg Shabbat is you light Shabbos candles, because in Isaiah it says you shall call Shabbat a delight. One place. And from that, we've got a whole Shabbat candle industry. Honor your parents. It mentions 2 times, but only because it repeats the 10 commandments. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. 3 times. It says this. And boy, does it make it hard to get a sandwich in Pico Robertson. Like today, this is something that just pervades the lives of many Jews, and it's because it mentions it in the Torah 3 times. I also like this passage because it's the proof text for my favorite part of the Talmud, Masechet Bava Metzia, around 58, 59. The whole rubric of ethical speech starts with this principle. And in that rubric, it mentions that the sages counted. In the Torah, it cautions us to be careful with the stranger 36 times. Shabbos candles once, honoring your parents twice, meat and milk 3 times, safeguard the dignity of the stranger 36 times. Why? Perhaps because it's so contrary to our nature. It is easy to oppress the stranger, especially if you've been oppressed. That is this instinct. That is where cycles of abuse come from. But here, the Torah does us the great favor of flipping human instinct and saying, no, you've been there. Someday you may be a widow. Someday you may be, God forbid, but it happens to most of us, an orphan. And every one of us at one point or another has been a stranger. That's why we are responsible. And remember, if you think a Yiddish mama has eyes in the back of her head when you mix the wrong forks together, what about the Kochabrichu? What about the Holy One of Blessing? Remember that the God who heard our cry, and that's why we're here today, because this is the God who hears cries, also hears the cries when we make people cry. This brings me to my single favorite verse of the Torah, which I will be delighted to teach you about tomorrow. Shabbat Shalom. I just did that for the faces in the Zoom call. So tomorrow we're going to be talking more about this idea, and I hope you'll be with us then. For now, I've really appreciated your celebrating Shabbat with us, and we will continue with our Ma'ariv service on page 28. I'd like to pause for a few words of Torah, if I may, and I'm glad to see a few Friday night folks here in the crowd. I'm not trying to segregate here. There are just some people who really gravitate toward Friday night services, and people who gravitate toward Saturday services. Everybody's got their rhythm. That's okay. But I thought, just for funsies, I would serialize my sermon. And so maybe some people who liked it on Friday night might want to stick around for the end here on Saturday morning, because last night I promised you that I would teach this Shabbat my very favorite verse in the entire Torah. And last night I taught my 3rd favorite verse and my 2nd favorite verse, and then I left you all on a cliffhanger. I'm sorry about that. But today I am delighted to teach you my number 1 favorite verse in the whole Torah. I call this my desert island pasuk. If you took the entire Torah away from me, but let me keep 1 verse. If I could look at 1 verse and spend my entire life learning how to properly live the spirit and the letter of the law therein, this would be that verse, and I'm excited to teach it to you. But first, I want to engage in a little bit of a thought experiment. This is an experiment that's laid out by a professor named John Rawls in his book, A Theory of Justice, and it's called The Veil of Ignorance. When trying to derive a theory of justice, he says, anybody could do this. All you have to do is close your eyes and imagine a world in which you get to decide all the laws. You get to decide how things are distributed economically. You get to decide how the justice system plays out. You get to decide everything. So how would you do it? Oh, one caveat. You don't know how you will be born. That is the veil of ignorance. You get to decide you get to design a just society, but you don't get to decide who you are when you're born into it. Whether you are born Jewish or Gentile, whether you are born white or black, whether you are born abled or disabled, whether you are born into a country that's stricken by poverty or into a neighborhood lifted up by luxury. If you don't know who you will be when you come into the world, how would you want that world to be when you got there? And I'll be the first to admit that this thought experiment really taxes one's empathy. Because most of us, at best, are self-conscious about how our life is, are self-aware about what we have, about what we don't have. And we can't really know, truly deeply know, what it's like to be another person from another class or another caste or another level of functioning of the body. We can't know. All we can do is reflect on our own experiences and estimate. That is what empathy is. And that brings me to my favorite verse in the whole Torah. It's Exodus, Sefer Shemot, chapter 23, verse 9. V'ger lo tilchatz, v'etem yadatem et nefesh hager, ki gerim haytem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feeling of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. Like I said, I could spend the rest of my life unpacking this verse in all of its implications. And at this point, I can see three distinct lines in this verse, three distinct trains of thought, three good reasons to be good people. And I want to lay them out for you today. First, you shall not oppress a stranger. If you take this on its own, if you leave out the rest of the verse, what you find is what continental philosophers call a categorical imperative. If you're a God person, you could just take this as, because I'm your father and I said so, you shall not oppress a stranger. It is a commandment. Therefore, that is how I shall behave. V'zehu, that's enough. But to a rationalist like Immanuel Kant and those who studied him, it's a good start. But even if you aren't following the theology here, you could rationally come up with this rule based on his principle of universality. The categorical imperative is that you should act in such a way as the maximum of your action could be followed by everyone in the world, regardless of their station, regardless of their reason. Act in such a way that you would want everyone to act. You shall not oppress a stranger, because you never know when the stranger is you. I don't know if he was a Kantian, but this is how Rabbi Hillel put it. That which is hateful to you, don't do to somebody else. But people who were continental philosophers echoed this, like Martin Buber, a German Jewish philosopher of the 19th and 20th century, went another route, took on Kant's principle of humanity, that you should treat no person as a means to your end, as solely a means to your end, but you should see every person as an end unto themselves, as a being of infinite dignity and worth. This is what he meant by his philosophy of I and thou. When we treat a person like chattel, when we treat a person like an instrument of our own well-being, we're not saying I, thou, we're saying I, it. We're treating a person like a tool. But if you can look into a person's eyes and see their full humanity, you also see God. When you encounter another person in the fullness of their own infinite value, you are invited to engage with God. And another philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, a French Jewish philosopher, took it one step further. When you encounter the realness of another person, you are not just invited to engage with God, you are obligated to engage God's will. You have a responsibility, a duty to that person. So we could stop with you shall not oppress the stranger, sof pasuk zehu. But it goes on. You know the nefesh hager. You know the heart of the stranger. You know the feelings of the stranger. And knowing that, you cannot turn away. Another set of philosophers, the utilitarians, could pick up on this and say this is the theory of value that we must maximize to increase happiness in the world, to decrease suffering in the world. And if we know suffering, we must stop it. And we know suffering. We know what it's like to be singled out, to be outlawed. We've been kicked out of every country in this world that's been a country, sometimes twice. We know what it's like to be deported for how we are born. We know what it's like to be driven away with the distance growing between ourselves and our children behind bars. You know the heart of the stranger, and you must act. To do otherwise is to betray your God-given empathy, to betray your God-called decency, to betray your very humanity. And why do we know this? Because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Fair is fair. This is why Rawls calls his theory of justice justice as fairness. If you know what it's like to be denigrated because how you were born, wouldn't you want to create a society that's fair to all, not knowing how the next person might be born or the next? Unless you think that having been oppressed gets us off the hook. Medieval commentators on this verse look at this phrase, you know what it's like to be a stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I believe it was Ibn Ezra who takes this line and says, and therefore you are responsible for them. This isn't some modern social justice warrior. This is a medieval rabbi of 1,000 years ago, sees this verse and says, if you know what that's like, silence is complicity. His words, not mine. By the way, as I noted earlier, this particular verse, which sounds a lot like a verse I talked about last night, in verse 22, 20, it says, "You shall not oppress the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt." Notice something that was missing from that verse that's in this verse, because you know that soul, you know that heart, you know that feeling. And not for nothing, that verse was directed at all of Yisrael. This verse is directed at judges, those with the most power to adjudicate fairness and to decide on life and death. It doesn't just argue the letter of the law, it digs into their kishkas and says, "Judge, you know what it's like to be a stranger." And you could probably look at me and say, "Who are you to be reading this way? Who are you to be telling us what to do, you big white hulk of privilege?" I'm a witness. See, I grew up in the South, in the rural part of East Texas that was segregated. And not segregated in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, not segregated just during Reconstruction. I'm talking about the elementary school that I went to in the 1980s, where of the 5 homeroom classes, 3 were 90% white and 2 were 90% black. I've been on the playground when a white kindergarten teacher picked up a boy by his wrist. His feet were off the ground and she spanked him. She beat this black child like she was beating out a rug. This was the 80s, and it's not over. And you can ask, who are you with your goyish apunim to tell us what we know, having been in the land of Egypt? You, John, joined this party late. That's true. And my son's grandparents were married in a displaced persons camp in Poland. The blood of my blood has a history, and the blood of my blood, God forbid, sun rises on another Pharaoh, has a stake in the future that is mortal. Any of us who have experienced being the new kid at school, the new guy at the office, a stranger in a strange land, and I'll admit, I'm stranger than most, but anybody who has had that experience knows and is responsible. In a moment that you encounter someone who is treated differently for being different, there's an instinct to ignore it. There is great societal pressure to keep quiet, to keep in your lane so that you can keep your place. Jews have fought long and hard to feel normal and to be treated equally in this society. There is a lot of pressure to not speak up. But there's a history of witness. In her new book, Cast, Isabella Wilkerson documents what the progenitors of the Third Reich, what the people who were deciding on what the Nuremberg blood laws should be, how do we best, most effectively scapegoat the Jews so that we can keep our own power? There are records of meetings that they had and testimonies of exchange students, German exchange students in law schools in the South of the United States of America. So when the Germans ask, how do we scapegoat an entire people and still hold our head up in the community of nations? They had records that Americans had been doing it for years. We, as much as we have fought, are intimately connected with everyone who's ever felt or been treated like a stranger in this country. I'm a witness. I have blood in this game. And we have a responsibility as the conscience of civilization. When the blood of our brothers crawls out from the ground, we cannot answer with silence. We can only say, Hineni, here I am. God calls for nothing more than that. Justice calls for nothing less. That's why this is my favorite verse in the whole Torah. And if I do nothing else with my life but live this out, it will be a life well lived. So that's why I wanted to share it with you. Shabbat Shalom, and thank you for joining us here at PJTC. We're going to continue our Torah service with a prayer for our country on page 148.